good afternoon there. Obviously, it's still good morning here. First of all, I would like to apologize for being late. I have no excuse except for the fact that I have been traveling incessantly for the last 4 weeks. I've been in England, Spain, France, and came back for 4 days, and then I've just come back from 4 days in Texas. So my head is spinning. So I just lost track of time this morning. So forgive me. So I would like to speak on the Catholicism of the Lord of the Rings. We're going to unlock the Lord of the Rings over the next 30 minutes or so. And then if you have time, I'm happy to hang around for questions if you have any. So J.R.R. Tolkien was a lifelong practicing Catholic, and he said that, and I'm quoting him here word for word, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work." Okay, so it's fundamentally religious and Catholic, and according to Tolkien, of course. Isn't it obvious? Well, it isn't obvious to most people. Obviously, it's not a formal allegory. There's no mention of Jesus Christ or the church or Christianity. So it's not obvious. The story takes place thousands of years before the time of Christ. So there's obviously no direct reference to Christianity. So how is The Lord of the Rings a fundamentally religious and Catholic work? Well, the one thing that unlocks The Lord of the Rings for us as a Catholic work is the date on which the ring is destroyed. And before we get to that, I want to backtrack a bit and look at the works of literature that influenced Tolkien. Tolkien was a medievalist. He was a specialist in the literature of the Middle Ages. So we can see certain techniques that are used in medieval literature that Tolkien resurrects in The Lord of the Rings. So one of these is the connection of the fictional narrative to the liturgical year, to the feast days of the church. So we can give some examples of this. In the Arthurian story, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which Tolkien translated from Middle English, Sir Gawain sets out on his quest to find the Green Knight. He announces that he is going to set out on his quest on All Saints' Day, November the 1st, a great feast day. But he then actually sets out on the following day, November the 2nd, All Souls' Day, when we pray for the suffering souls in purgatory. So this is a day of penance. And Sir Gawain goes to confession on this penitential day and then sets out on his quest. He can't find the Green Knight's castle, and during Advent, another penitential season, he is wandering in the deserts of North Wales without any sign of civilization or the Green Knight's castle or even a church. So on Christmas Eve, Sir Gawain prays that he might find a church so that he can go to Mass on Christmas Day. And this prayer is answered on Christmas morning with the magical appearance of the Green Knight's castle. So what we see here in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is that the story takes place during a penitential season from All Souls through Advent, and then the miraculous vision of the Green Knight's castle, and then the rest of the action takes place during the Christmas season. All right, so Tolkien translated that work. The most famous work of medieval literature uses the same technique. So in Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante, the character in the story, is lost in the dark wood of sin on Holy Thursday, on Maundy Thursday. He descends into hell on Good Friday. He emerges from the inferno into the light of day at the bottom of Mount Purgatory on Easter Sunday morning, and then goes up through purgatory and into heaven during the Easter season, the time of resurrection. So you see that in medieval literature, the allegorical connection is made through the use of liturgically significant dates. Now let's go back to the Lord of the Rings. The ring is destroyed on March the 25th. Now this is a hugely significant date for two reasons. The best known reason is that March the 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation. And because human life, begins at conception and not at birth, the Annunciation is a much more significant and important date than Christmas, because Christmas is when Christ is born, but the date on which the Word becomes flesh, the date on which God becomes man, is March the 25th, at the Annunciation, at the conception of Christ in the womb of the Blessed Virgin. So March the 25th is hugely significant in that sense. But even more, in the Middle Ages, it was believed by tradition that the date of the crucifixion was also March the 25th. Now, of course, we don't assign a particular date to Good Friday because it's a movable feast. Easter and Good Friday is a movable feast connected to the spring equinox, etc. But of course, the crucifixion as an historical event took place on one specific date in history. And according to tradition, this was March the 25th. We can go even further back, because according to tradition, this was also the date in which Abraham offered to sacrifice Isaac, which is a prophetic prefiguring of the crucifixion. So March the 25th is probably the most single significant date on the Christian calendar. The date on which the Word becomes flesh, God becomes man, the date on which Christ is crucified for our sins. And of course, you take the incarnation together with the crucifixion and of course the resurrection, and what we get is our redemption. And what are we redeemed from? We're redeemed from the power of sin. What is the one ring? The one ring is the one ring to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. What is original sin? Original sin is the one sin to rule them all, and in the darkness bind. The one ring and the one sin are both destroyed on the same significant date of March the 25th. So when you understand that, you see that the ring is synonymous with sin itself. So what does this mean? Well, when we put the ring on, it's the act of sin. We are choosing to enter the world of the Dark Lord. Sauron in the Lord of the Rings, we are told in the Silmarillion, is the greatest of Satan's servants. He's an archdemon. So when we put the ring on, we enter that spiritually satanic, demonic world. We excommunicate ourselves from the good world that God made, and we enter the shadow world of darkness and demonic power. If we put the ring on habitually, repeatedly, or if we keep it on for any long period of time, psychologically, our souls begin to shrivel. There should be a new verb in the English language, to gollumize. That if we continue to behave in this manner, we will gollumize ourselves. We will become like Gollum. we will shrivel and shrink and be completely addicted to the power of sin, so that we have no other desire but to keep ourselves united to it. All right, but if instead of wearing the ring, we are bearing the ring, instead of being ring wearers, we are ring bearers. We are, instead of committing sin, we are carrying the burden of sin without sinning. So in this sense, we can see the carrying of the ring as being synonymous with the carrying of the cross, not just the cross of Christ himself, but Christ commands us to take up our cross and follow him. That the Christian life is to voluntarily bear the burden of sin without sinning, to take up our cross, to act self-sacrificially. All right, so now we understand this. We can start to look at who are the Christ figures in The Lord of the Rings. And the most obvious one as the ring bearer would be Frodo Baggins. And this is made very clear because the date on which the Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo and his fellows in the Fellowship, the date on which Frodo and the Fellowship leave Rivendell is December the 25th, which makes Frodo's journey from Rivendell to Mount Doom, Golgotha, the life of Jesus Christ from the date of Christ's birth to the date of his death. So Frodo is, in this sense, a Christ figure. But Tolkien is much more subtle than, for instance, C.S. Lewis. So in the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan is always a figure of the Son of God at all times in all 7 stories, unmistakably. Tolkien's more subtle. There is no one character who signifies Christ in that way. But certain characters remind us of Christ in a much more subtle way and nuanced way. So insofar as Frodo Baggins is the ring bearer who leaves Rivendell on December the 25th and arrives at Mount Doom on March the 25th, he reminds us of Christ. And insofar as he is the ring bearer, he is the cross bearer and therefore a Christ figure. But throughout the remainder of the story, in every other aspect of who he is merely Frodo Baggins of the Shire, a hobbit, much more subtle. A second Christ figure is Gandalf. Gandalf lays down his life for his friends. No greater love has any man, says Christ, than to lay down his life for his friends. So Gandalf dies in the mines of Moria, fighting the Balrog. And we know from the Silmarillion that Balrogs are demons, right? They're not huge monsters, physical monsters like Tyrannosaurus Rex. They are like dragons. They are demonic. The Balrog is a demon. So Gandalf dies, and we are told he did die a real death. He wasn't pretending. He didn't go to sleep. He didn't hang out. He died. And if we haven't had the story spoiled for us, we are as devastated by Gandalf's death as are the rest of the Fellowship. We didn't see it coming, and we're horrified by it. And then for a few hundred pages, Gandalf is dead. And then when we see him again, resurrected from the dead, he's no longer Gandalf the Grey. He is Gandalf the White. And his cloak is so dazzling, it's like looking at the sun. You have to avert your gaze because it's too bright. So that Gandalf has to put over his grey cloak over the white cloak, and it's like a cloud passing over the sun. So what we see in Gandalf is death, resurrection, and transfiguration. And these 3 things together, of course, signify that Gandalf is also in this respect a Christ figure, the one who dies, the one who's resurrected, and the one who's transfigured. But for the rest of the story, he's merely Gandalf the wizard. Now, the third Christ figure is Aragorn. Aragorn is a Christ figure in his true kingship. In both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, there's the motif, the theme of the return of the king. Obviously, it's Thorin Oakenshield in The Hobbit, the return of the dwarf king to his kingdom, to the Lonely Mountain. In The Lord of the Rings, of course, it's Strider, the true king, coming back to claim his kingdom of Gondor. Now, in English folklore, particularly English Catholic folklore, the return of the king is a very powerful motif. First of all, King Arthur is not just an historic king who lived and died like all other historic kings. There's something magical about King Arthur because he is known as the once and future king. In other words, that in mythology, that when things get really, really bad for England, Arthur will return to deliver England from her enemies, as he did in his own day. So this Arthurian motif, and again, remember, Tolkien is a medievalist. He knows these Arthurian legends very well. He translated Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of the Arthurian legends. And then another piece of English folklore, much more recent, this is English history. Back in 1688, one of the most treacherous episodes in not just English history, but in all human history took place, that the Protestants called a glorious revolution. They admit it's a revolution because the true king was overthrown. The true king was James II. And because James II was a Catholic, the first Catholic king in England for 150 years, except for a period of Queen Mary, that by this time, the wealthy merchants and the Puritans in Parliament, so the politicians and the big businessmen, would not tolerate a Catholic king in fear that the king might want some of the church land that was stolen from the church and given to the new breed of aristocrats back to the church. So what they do, and this is why I called it an act of great treachery, they pay for an army of foreign mercenaries led by a foreign king to invade their own country to overthrow the legitimate king. So throughout the following century, there was this great desire amongst the English, particularly, and the Scots, for the return of the true king, who was the Catholic king. And there were two Jacobite uprisings in England in the 1700s. Jacobite is from the Latin Jacobus, James. So these are the followers of James, the true king. And they two uprisings, both of which ultimately failed. So for an English historical sensibility, the true king is in exile. Those who claim to be kings on the throne are like the stewards of Minas Tirith. They have authority, but only until the true king returns. And of course, true king ultimately for Christians is the return of Christ the King, for which all Christians are waiting. So these three facets of the waiting for the return of the king. Now it's said that the true king, the hands of the king are the hands of a healer. So Aragorn has great healing powers. But even more important than that, it is said that only the true king can take the path of the dead and survive. Only the true king can take the path of the dead and survive. Any other person, any other mortal that takes the path of the dead dies. They become the dead. But Aragorn not only has the power to take the path of the dead and survive, he has the power to release the dead themselves from their curse. And this, of course, reminds us of Christ descending into hell following his crucifixion and opening the gates of hell to the power of the resurrection. So in his kingship and his power over death itself, Aragorn is a Christ figure. So three Christ figures: Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn. And I'm going to conclude with looking at who are we in the story? In other words, where are the everyman figures, those who represent us? And we go through those for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll stop for as much time as you like for questions. Well, in one sense, the hobbits, in a general sense, us, the Shire, is an idealized agrarian society based upon an idyllic, perfect rural England, non-industrial. So the hobbits, in some sense, are everyman figures. It's the exaltation of the humble, of the small. The reason that the ring is safe in the Shire for so long is that the proud, those who are ruled by pride, such as Sauron, don't even know that the humble exist. You know, the small, irrelevant people, the poor, the powerless. Who cares about them? So in that sense, the hobbits are everyman figures. But beyond that, the one who represents us most, and most obviously, is Boromir. And the reason is simple. In the Fellowship of the Ring, there are 4 hobbits, a wizard, a king, and then there are representatives of the 3 races. Gimli represents the dwarfs, Legolas represents the elves, and Boromir represents the men. He is our representative in the Fellowship. He's our representative in the story. And of course, that's a little bit sobering, because Boromir is the traitor. Boromir is the one who will take the ring from Frodo. He's the one that will use the power of the ring. Now, his logic is fair enough. His country is about to be invaded by an army of orcs, the commander-in-chief of which is a demon that far outnumbers his own people. There's no realistic expectation of anything except defeat. So for Boromir, this powerful weapon, the ring, is a gift. We should use it against the enemy. But the wise know that if you use evil means to a good end, you become evil yourself. So if the ring had been wielded against Mordor, if Boromir had been successful in defending Gondor and Minas Tirith from the powers of Mordor through the use of the ring, Gondor would have become an evil empire under the power of the ring. And that's not a victory, it's a defeat. It would be much better for the people of Minas Tirith to die heroically, every last man, woman, and child, defending their civilization from the satanic forces of Mordor, than to become like the satanic forces of Mordor in trying to defend themselves. So, but Boromir, if you go back and read it carefully, the book, his final moments follow the Catholic sacrament of confession exactly in terms of form. He confesses his sin. He's contrite. He's sorry for his sin. He pays for his sin through an act of contrition, dying to save the hobbits. And he says, I have failed. And the priest who's there at the sacrament of confession, and the priest at the sacrament of confession is in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. Well, who is that? It's Aragorn, who is the Christ figure in the story himself. And he tells Boromir he hasn't failed. He's won a great victory. And the last act, while he's alive, of Boromir is to smile. So he dies a holy and heroic death, confessing his sins, being absolved for his sins, and going to heaven. Better than that, the other everyman figure is Faramir. Now, again, literarily, Tolkien connects them. He's not just another man, like all the other men. He is Boromir's brother. So he's our other representative. And Faramir says, I would not pick up the ring if I saw it lying at the side of the road. And he also says that I would not snare even an orc with a falsehood. not even the smallest lie to the devil himself. So Tolkien gives us Faramir, this man who's basically a saint. He gives us Boromir, a man who is a sinner, but who dies heroically. They're two pretty good images for who we are. But the sobering fact is that the other everyman figure in the story is Gollum. Because as Alexander Solzhenitsyn reminds us, the battle between good and evil takes place in each individual human heart. That battle between human evil is the battle between the two human models that we follow. We are either homo viator in Latin, man on a journey, man on a pilgrimage, man on a quest. The purpose of our life's journey is to get to heaven. That's the object of the quest. Or we are homo superbus, from the Latin word for pride, superbia. Homo superbus is proud man who refuses the quest, who refuses the journey, who refuses the pilgrimage, who will not go where he's supposed to go, but goes where he wants, or refuses to go anywhere at all. In both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, it's important that Bilbo and Frodo leave their comfort zone, leave their hobbit hole, and take the adventure, go on the quest. And if we refuse that, if we allow homo superbus to win that civil war in our hearts, we become like Gollum. We become enslaved to the power of sin and addicted to our bad behaviors, and we shrivel and shrink, and we're no longer the heroic hobbit that we're called to be, and become a pathetic Gollum instead. All right, so I want to wind things up now. I want to maybe finish with a little bit of whimsicality, a little bit of humor. We know, if we read The Lord of the Rings, or if we've seen the films, what the Palantir stones are, the Palantiri. The Palantir stones are those crystal balls. When you look into them, you don't necessarily see a complete lie, but you only see what the dominant will wants you to see. You receive the propaganda of the enemy, the one who has the power over the seeing stones. So therefore, only a fool spends his time looking in it, because they receive the enemy's propaganda. So in the case of Denethor, he becomes so convinced that it's futile to even fight the forces of darkness that he commits suicide. Now, Palantir in Elvish, we're told in the story, means far-seer or far-seeing. The German word for television is Fernsehen, which means far-seeing or far-seer. The English word for television also means far-seeing. Tele is the Greek for far, vision from video, to see. Tolkien was horrified by the way that the radio was used during World War II by all sides to tell lies. Propaganda, no truth. And television was the new technology when he was writing this. So by Tolkien, a linguistic joke, but nonetheless a serious one, that the television has the same sort of power as the Palantir stone to feed to those who look into it only what the dominant will wants you to see. And of course, since that time, we have different types of Palantir stones. Most of them now we hold up. I have one myself here, right, in front of our face all day long. So Tolkien teaches us many, many valuable lessons in The Lord of the Rings. But he is absolutely correct when he says, and as I hope I've demonstrated, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Thank you. I know it's late, for which I apologise, but I'm happy to take some questions if you have time. That's up to you.
Yeah, we have a question. We have time for time. Lady wanted to know how do you say in Latin man on the path, homo viator.
Homo viator, yes. So I can spell it. 2 words, H-O-M-O, so man, and it's man in the inclusive sense. It means men and women. Masculine man is V-I-R, vir in classical Latin. So homo means all of us. And in viator, V-I-A, as in the way, viator, T-O-R, V-I-A-T-O-R, homo viator, man on a journey, man on a quest, or to baptize it, man on a pilgrimage.
We have 2 questions. So the question is, who dwarfs? Who do they represent? Let's say, which part of humanity they represent? The dwarfs.
Dwarves. Well, the first thing is that Tolkien is much more subtle than making every character or every race in the story signify something directly allegorical. So I don't think the dwarves have any direct reference as an everyman figure. I think the men and the hobbits fulfill that purpose, that function. There's a very interesting backstory about the dwarves, which I'm not going to answer now because it would take too long. But in the Silmarillion, the way that the dwarves are created by Aule against the will of God, but then Aule repents and offers to destroy the creatures. And at that point, God stays his hand and prevents them being destroyed, because in his act of repentance, God forgives him for his sin in creating a race of people secretly from God. But then he says, you cannot bring them to life until the ordained time. So put them away, put the dwarves away. And then at the time that I say in the story that I'm telling, history, then you can bring them out. So it's very interesting. And there's a lot of the philosophy of Tolkien's philosophy of creativity in that story. And I teach next week, I'm teaching, week after next, I'm teaching a 2-week course in Florida, Ave Maria University, on Tolkien's philosophy of myth. So I could say much more, but we don't have time.
So the question is, what's the most important lecture you've learned reading Tolkien?
Well, that's a great question. I think that The Lord of the Rings is so rich, it's so full of life, that I'm always learning new lessons every time I return to the text. In this sense, it's a reflection of its biblical power. Of course, whenever we return to the Bible, new insights can emerge to us. The same thing with The Lord of the Rings. So I think in my initial, when I first read it, I was not a Christian. I was on the path to conversion, but I was not a Christian. And I think the important thing is it taught me that goodness, virtue is inseparable from laying down our lives self-sacrificially. That there's no goodness without self-sacrifice. There's no goodness without the cross in Christian terms. And I think that's what The Lord of the Rings showed me at first, a very powerful lesson that stays with me today.
So the trilogy, the film trilogy, how of a good representation of the books? How is it? Is it a good or a bad, or what would you say?
And the Peter Jackson version of The Lord of the Rings first came out 20 years ago now, believe it or not. I took part in something at the university at which I was teaching, the trial of Peter Jackson for the desecration of The Lord of the Rings. And we had an attorney for the prosecution and an attorney for the defense. So one is defending Peter Jackson and one is prosecuting Peter Jackson. And we had a jury of 12 students dressed up as hobbits with hairy feet to judge. We did this twice. I was the counsel or the attorney for the defense of Peter Jackson. So in other words, that my view was that Peter Jackson did not desecrate The Lord of the Rings. I could put my purist hat on and come up with a list of things wrong with the films as long as my arm. But the point is that Peter Jackson knew he was investing so much money in this very ambitious project, 3.5 hour films with top stars, filmed on location in New Zealand. It was costing a huge amount of money. He knew he had to win over the millions of lovers of Tolkien around the world, to have them on his side so that they could market the film ahead of time. And he went to great lengths to get the Tolkien world on board. And one way he did that was to promise that he would not make too many egregious changes to the story. And he did make changes, but for the most part, not many. However, Peter Jackson, following the success of The Lord of the Rings, then got the dragon sickness. He became possessed by his possessions and greedy. And the Hobbit movies are horrible. I saw the first one and thought this is bad. And then when someone saw the second one and said it was worse, I didn't watch it, nor did I watch the third. And as for the new Amazon Rings of Power, that's basically where Mordor has taken over The Lord of the Rings.
Do we still have some minutes, maybe?
I owe you time because I'm late. If you don't mind staying, I don't mind staying.
Okay. So the symbol of Galadriel, who does she? Is she the picture of Our Lady?
So Tolkien said in one of his letters that he put all of his love of the Blessed Virgin Mary into the characterization of Galadriel. So we are meant to see a Marian dimension to her. She is meant to remind us of the Blessed Virgin. And one thing that Peter Jackson did well, especially in the extended edition, the last we see of Galadriel as they're sailing off, down the river, standing on the bank of the river, she looks very much like Our Lady of Fatima or Our Lady of Lourdes. And she looks like the Blessed Virgin. So I think Peter Jackson was consciously trying to get that iconography in place, and I'm thankful for that.
I have two questions, but I'll try not to put the other question. So first one is the concept of the long defeat. Tolkien's philosophy of time, of history. So can you tell us a little bit about that? I think people are not so much acquainted with that concept.
So Tolkien said in one of his letters...
To repeat the question to the people. I will have to repeat the question to the...
Please. Please.
Znači, ideja long defeat, dugotrajni poraz, Tolkienova filozofija povijesti vremena. So, yes, sorry.
So Tolkien, in one of his letters, said that as a Christian, I see history as the long defeat with only occasional glimpses of final victory. And in The Lord of the Rings, Galadriel says that she and her husband Celeborn have fought the long defeat for ages of this world and have won many fruitless victories. So what does that mean? What is Tolkien's philosophy of history, shall we say? We live in a fallen cosmos where there's something within the very fabric of the physical cosmos which is broken and under the power of death. So physical laws such as entropy signify that basically things are always in the process of dying. So metaphysically, that means in this world, we are fallen, broken individuals. We can continue to fight against evil, but we cannot win a final victory against it this side of the grave, because evil always grows back like a fungus. We have to then once again cut down, and it's an ongoing struggle from the beginning of time to the end of time, the long defeat. The glimpses of final victory are off stage. The glimpses of final victory are in eternity. The glimpses of final victory are in heaven with Christ. So what we have to understand is that we are part of the church militant, right? The church at war. The church in eternity, which is much larger and will last for much longer, is the church triumphant. The church has already won the victory, but we are in a war zone. So for our lives, our 70 years and 10, 70 or 80 years or less or more, for the length of our lives, we are an active service in a civil war between Homo viator and Homo superbus, a war that takes place in our own heart as well as in our own society. And we just have to be loyal, good soldiers of Christ, miles Christi, soldiers of Christ, during our life on earth, and then we attain the final unending victory. And as for that, there's no better way of putting it than the final sentences of the final book of the Chronicles of Narnia, where Tolkien says there that this life is just the cover and the title page. The real story for each of us has not even started yet. The real story begins after we die, and then it's a story that goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. In other words, we don't just live as in a fairy story, happily ever after. We live happier and happier ever after.
Thank you. I have just one last question. So the role of the providence in destroying the ring. Znači uloga providnosti u uništavanju prstena. So how did it use the Gollum and Sauron and everything?
Yeah, so thanks for asking that question, because if I wasn't in a hurry, I normally end my talk with this discussion of providence. So this allows me to end at the way my talk should have ended. So when we read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, and we don't know what's going to happen, and we move following Frodo Baggins from the beginning of the story at walking pace, right? Most of the time he's on foot. The story takes place on foot. Hilaire Belloc says the best way to go on pilgrimage is on foot. I've just come back from the Camino. I did Tolkien on the Camino, and we walked about 100 miles of the Camino on foot, right? So we follow Frodo at walking pace. And then after nearly 1,000 pages, he finally reaches Mount Doom. Now, after all this struggle is the easy part. I will demonstrate how easy it is, all right? Here's a ring. There we are. That wasn't difficult. That felt so easy, I'm going to do it again. All he has to do is throw the ring into Mount Doom. It's easy. He's done all the hard work. But he fails. And when we first read the story, we're outraged. Frodo Baggins, how dare you drag me for 800 pages for this anticlimax? How dare you? And then we have our first experience of literary criticism, because we realize it's not poor Frodo Baggins' fault. Frodo Baggins had no choice. It's Tolkien's fault. And then we say to Tolkien, Tolkien, you miserable loser, how dare you drag us this far and not let Frodo destroy the ring? Then, after the anger subsides, if you know your Christian theology, you realize this is the most brilliant part of the story. Because if the ring does signify sin, we know as Christians we cannot defeat the power of sin through the triumph of the will. All the self-help religions, how to save yourself, how to get to heaven by yourself, are all wrong. We cannot succeed in the battle against evil, the battle against sin, without supernatural assistance, what theologians call grace. There was a heresy of the church which has carried on through all the centuries called Pelagianism. And that was basically, all you have to do is to listen to what Jesus said and do it. You can get to heaven through the power of your own will. And that heresy is wrong, because if it's true, you don't need the church, you don't need the sacraments, you don't even need to pray, right? You just do what Jesus said and you get to heaven. It's a lie and it's a heresy. So if the ring signifies sin, Frodo does not have the power to throw the ring in. He wants to hold on to his sin, not to let it go. So it takes providence. And then you're thinking, Gollum is providence? How does that work? But at the beginning of the story, towards the beginning of the story, Frodo Baggins says to Gandalf, I wish Uncle Bilbo had killed that miserable creature when he had the chance. It's a pity that he didn't. And Gandalf says, pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. And then Gandalf says, I'm sure that Gollum has some role still to play. And then later in the story, at the Forbidden Pool, when Frodo has the opportunity to kill Gollum, he says, now I do see him, I do pity him. And he stays his hand, he doesn't kill him. Later, Samwise Gamgee has the opportunity to kill Gollum and doesn't. If any of those three had killed Gollum, Gollum would not have been there. The ring would not have been defeated. In other words, there's a providential reward for acts of virtue. The toughest commandment that Jesus Christ gives us is to love our enemy. Not easy. Bilbo Baggins showed mercy to his enemy. Frodo Baggins showed mercy to his enemy. Samwise Gamgee showed mercy to his enemy. And that's why their enemy was there at the crucial moment to deliver them from evil. It's an act of absolute brilliance on Tolkien's part.
Thank you. I think this is... There's still one question, I think. Is it okay? Okay.
Absolutely.
Aha, zašto je otišao na zapad? So the question is, did Frodo had to go to west, with the last ship with the elves when they were leaving the? So did he have to go? Why is it, let's say, a sad moment? Or
I don't think he had to go in the sense of he had no choice, but I think that the key thing here we might get from the wonderful hymn or prayer, the Salve Regina, that this is this life, Middle Earth, and Tolkien says that Middle Earth is here, right? This life is a vale of tears, a valley of tears, and a land of exile. That we don't really belong here, none of us. We belong in heaven. That's where we're supposed to be striving for, because that's our true home, not here. Exile, the sense of exile is only possible because of a sense of home, right? Exile is being away from home and the pain that comes from being away from home. So because Frodo Baggins had such an intense encounter with the power of sin in the ring, but also an intense encounter with the power of mercy in God's providence, that sense of exile is much more pronounced in him, that what he doesn't belong here anymore. None of us belong here. But for Frodo Baggins, it felt much more strongly than it does to us that we don't belong here. This is no abiding city, that he needed to go into the mystic West. And the reason the mystic West, by the way, this is set before the time of Christ, so Tolkien has to be careful about the way that he words things. But the mystic West, of course, in the Middle Ages, we didn't know what was West. And there's the mystical voyage of St. Brendan, the navigator who sails into the mystic West, has all these heavenly visions. So Tolkien, again, being a medievalist, that's a metaphor for leaving the bent world. In actual fact, the description, read it again. At some point, the ship ceases to follow around the bent world. In other words, the circular world, and goes off at a tangent. Now, it's not taking off into space. It's leaving physics and entering metaphysics, leaving time and entering eternity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Again, apologies for my lateness, and forgive me. Okay, in Latin, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Okay.
I think everybody's very satisfied with it.
Okay.
Nice,
well, thank you.
It was the cherry on the top.
Thank you. I hope it's worth waiting for. God bless you.
No, wait. There's one question which I'm very interested in. When are you coming to Croatia?
I'm going to come to Croatia as soon as you wonderful folks over there can make it happen.
Okay, we'll bring you next year.
Okay, that sounds great. Let's consider it a date.
Okay, we'll arrange a date. Thank you so much, Joseph, okay. And God bless you, and see you soon.
My pleasure. God bless you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.